Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Office of Research Administration Social Justice Working Group. My name is David Ramirez, co-host. This session will be recorded. Today, we are featuring a presentation by Dr. Andrés Reséndez, and he asked me to address him as Andrés. Andrés received his Bachelor's of Arts in International Relations at the Colegio de México in 1992, a Master's of Arts in History at the University of Chicago in 1992, and a PhD in History at the University of Chicago in 1997. During his years as a graduate student, Reséndez served as a consultant for historical soap operas. He went on to teach at Yale University and University of Helsinki. He is currently a professor in the Department of History at the University of California, Davis. In his book, The Other Slavery, Andrés builds an incisive case that it was mass slavery, more than epidemics, that decimated Indian populations across North America. Through riveting new evidence, including testimonies of courageous priests, rapacious merchants, and Indian captives, The Other Slavery reveals nothing less than a key missing piece of continental American history. Andrés, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. You may begin.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here. And my plan is to try to speak for about 40 minutes and then leave some minute for questions and comments, which is always very rewarding. So slavery is the topic at hand, and it's a word that brings to mind generally the bodies of Africans stuffed in the hold of a ship, or white apron maids bustling in an antebellum home. History books and movies continuously, oops, I somehow can't make this PowerPoint move forward. God, here we go. We may be aware that in the long sweep of history, peoples other than Africans have been held in bondage, but we still seem unable to escape our historical myopia. And so my book, The Other Slavery, tells about this other system of bondage that targeted Native Americans, a system that was every bit as terrible, degrading, and vast as African slavery, and yet many people are not aware of it. According to my estimates, anywhere between 2.5 and 5 million Native Americans were enslaved throughout the American hemisphere in the time between Columbus and the end of the 19th century. And interestingly, in contrast to African slavery, which targeted mostly adult males, the majority of the indigenous slaves were women and children. It was a big deal, but we somehow chosen to forget about this. I will start out by emphasizing that Indian slavery was not a European invention. Mayas and Aztecs took captives to use as sacrificial victims. Iroquois peoples waged campaigns on neighboring groups called mourning wars to avenge and replace the dead. And in the Pacific Northwest, indigenous peoples offered slaves as dowries to finalize elite marriages. So along with the rest of the planet, Native Americans enslaved each other for millennia. So this was the case, but with the arrival of Europeans, these pre-existing practices of bondage, originally embedded in specific cultural context, became commercialized, expanded in unexpected ways, and came to resemble the human trafficking that is recognizable to us today. This transformation, and so here, just another example of these pre-Columbian types of captivities. This is a beautiful image of the Codex Mendoza in the middle of the 16th century. Whoa. And you can see that if you can read the gloss in Spanish, it says cautivo, captive. And that was the pictorial representation of captives, was people held by the hair. This transformation began with the earliest European explorers. During his second voyage to America in 1493, Columbus himself sent dozens of indigenous peoples from the Caribbean, and accompanying them was a candid letter addressed to the Spanish monarchs. May your highness judge whether these Indians ought to be captured, for I believe we could make many of the males every year and an infinite number of women. And may you also believe that one of them would be worth more than 3 black slaves from Guinea in strength and ingenuity, as you will gather from those that I'm shipping out today. And so in this way, Columbus inaugurated the Middle Passage, complete with the overcrowding and high mortality rates that we commonly associate with African slavery, but which in fact can be traced back to this earlier form of slavery, or the other slavery, as I call it. Eventually, all European powers became important participants in the Indian slave trade: the English, the French, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. But Spain, by virtue of the enormous and densely populated colonies that it ruled in the New World, became the dominant slaving power. Spain was to Indian slavery what Portugal and England were to African slavery. And ironically, Spain began by forbidding the enslavement of Native Americans. Yet this categorical prohibition did not stop generations of determined conquistadors and colonists from taking native slaves truly on a planetary scale, from the eastern seaboard of the United States and further north in Canada to the tip of South America, and from the Canary Islands in the Atlantic to the Philippines in the Pacific. And the fact that this other slavery had to be carried out clandestinely made it even more insidious. This is a tale of good intentions gone badly astray. So the Caribbean was the laboratory of conquest, and it was also the first and quite likely the worst native slaving ground in the world. At contact, the Caribbean sustained a large indigenous population. Yet, from this high point, a tragic demographic collapse followed. By the 1550s, merely 2 generations after contact, the natives, so memorably described by Columbus as affectionate and without malice, and having very straight legs and no bellies, quote unquote, had ceased to exist as a people. As any school child knows, smallpox was a major reason for this devastation. But blaming everything on unintended biological consequences is just too easy and not borne out by the sources. Take, for instance, Hispaniola, the island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which you can see on your screens. Italian demographer Massimo Livi Bacci has recently made the crucial point that the first certain documentation of smallpox in Hispaniola appears only in 1518. And yet, even though 26 years passed before the first documented cases of smallpox began to appear, the native population on this island found itself on a clear path to extinction. At contact in 1492, Hispaniola may have had a population that can reasonably be estimated at around 100,000, perhaps 200,000 people. By 1508, that figure had fallen to 60,000. By 1514, it stood at nearly 26,000, according to a fairly comprehensive census and no longer guesswork. And by 1517, that number had plunged to just 11,000 Native Americans. In other words, 1 year before Europeans began reporting smallpox, Hispaniola's indigenous population had dwindled to perhaps 5% or less of what it had been in 1492. While it is impossible to rule out completely the possibility of unreported epidemics, it is obvious that other factors were at work in the early years. As it turns out, Europeans found the largest deposits of gold on Hispaniola, and they quickly put the local residents to work. So here I'm showing you an image that appears in Oviedo's Chronicle of the Indies. Oviedo himself was not only a chronicler, but he was also involved in the silver trade and gold trade. And so this is something that he knew very well. And so he depicted 3 indigenous peoples. The one on the right-hand side represents a person, but it could also be a group of indigenous peoples whose job it was to dig, especially close to streams, as you can see there, where the little nuggets of gold were to be found. A second group of people, represented by the figure in the middle, would carry that sand mixed with just a handful of grains of gold to a nearby river. And a third group, represented by the figure on the left-hand side, often consisting of women, would use this very large wooden pan called batea in order to wash away the sand and so as to leave the gold nuggets at the bottom of the batea. These may not sound like a terrible type of job, and it will get worse, but of course, work like this performed for 12, 16, 18 hours a day took a toll. By the early 1500s, the number of indigenous peoples at Hispaniola had plunged so drastically that the remaining population was no longer able to provide enough labor for the gold mines, let alone the planting and harvesting of basic foodstuffs. To replenish that dwindling workforce, European slavers fanned out to the neighboring Caribbean islands, thus spreading the demographic cataclysm throughout the circum-Caribbean. So this map I drew with the help of permits, filed by Spanish slavers. They had to report where their ships were departing from, where their ships were going to, and it was semi-legal to do this slaving. And so we can see that many of these slavers departed from the large islands of the Antilles, Hispaniola, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and they went to either the coast of northern South America, what is now the coast of Venezuela, or to the Bahamas, that at the time were called the Lucayas, or the useless islands, because there was no gold there, or to even the coast of Florida, as you can see on the map. Now, gold was the initial impetus for procuring large amounts of labor. And in the United States, when we think of gold, the unavoidable reference is to the California gold rush. Altogether, California produced some 3.7 million kilograms of gold, and in the process attracted some 300,000 people from the rest of the world. It was a major phenomenon. Yet, the exploitation of silver rather than gold was what became the preeminent Indian slavery activity in the Americas. And here I have a chart of the kilograms of silver and gold. The kilograms of silver are on the left-hand side. The kilograms of gold extracted from California are on the right-hand side. And you can see, first of all, that in terms of duration, the California gold rush was like a hurricane, right? So gold production skyrocketed in 1849, but peaked only 40 years later. And for all practical purposes, it was over within 20 years. By contrast, the earlier silver boom that I'm talking about started in the 1520s. It grew consistently through the 16th century. It kind of plateaued in the 17th century, and it gained a second wind in the 18th century, attaining the high water mark in the first decades of the 19th century, almost 300 years later. So a much longer duration. The silver boom would end up producing 44.2 million kilograms of silver, so about 12 times as much of the gold produced in California. So really, to get a sense of what we're talking about, you have to imagine about 12 or 13 gold rushes strung out over the course of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And in terms of geography, the silver boom was far more broadly distributed. So here's a map of the various silver mines just in Mexico. Mind you, there were other silver mines, especially in Peru. So if this fantastic silver boom had occurred in the 19th century, Mexico would have become a worldwide magnet like California. In an era of newspapers, steamboats, and widespread transoceanic travel, there is little doubt that the great Mexican silver mines would have lured immigrants from all quarters of the world. But because this boom predated all of these communications and transportation conveniences and unfolded at a time when the Spanish monarchy prohibited all foreigners from going to the silver districts, Mexico had to make do with its own human resources, especially indigenous peoples. California attracted 300,000 people from the rest of the world, yet colonial Mexico had to satisfy a hugely greater labor demand with no access to volunteers from the rest of the world. So here is a picture from an American mining engineer from 1905 that gives you a sense of the labor conditions in some of these mines. So this picture was taken in the mine in La Valenciana, which is one mine in Guanajuato, Mexico, central Mexico. What you are seeing here is one particular group of workers known as tenateros. Their job was simply to go down through the mine shaft, get loads of ore up to the ground. So you can see that they are actually holding these fiber bags that are dangling from their foreheads. And they had to do this because they had to use their hands and their legs in order to climb ladders. The exploitation of silver was far more involved than the gold, in that the silver was admixed with other elements and other substances. So you had to get the ore up, then crush it to a pulp. Then you had to mix it with mercury and other highly toxic reagents in order to extract the silver. So a far more involved process that required far more work than what you had for gold. So again, it's just to give you a sense, the scale was much bigger than the California gold rush. It happened all over Mexico. It happened in Peru as well, and it lasted for 3 centuries rather than 20 years. So just for comparison purposes. Now, these connections, these silver connections, explain a great deal of the historical experience of what is not only Mexico, but also what would become the American Southwest. For instance, in the summer of 1680, the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico rose up and launched a massive rebellion known as the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. The nervous center of this movement was the Pueblo of Taos in northern New Mexico. You can see it on this map at the top right corner of the map. And from inside a kiva, or underground chamber used for ceremonial occasions, a local shaman named Popeye, that might be familiar to some of you, dispatched runners to more than 70 indigenous communities, some of them as far away as the present-day Hopi Reservation in Arizona, some 300 miles away. And remember, indigenous peoples were prohibited from riding horses, so they had to go either walking or running to these places. Popeye's plan was to get all of these indigenous communities to rise up on the same day to overwhelm the much smaller Spanish population living in what is now New Mexico and Arizona. And to this end, he dispatched these runners who were also carrying an extraordinary device, a cord made of fiber containing as many knots as there were days before the insurrection. And that way, by untying one knot every day, each community would know exactly when to strike. The revolt swept through New Mexico on August 10 and 11, 1680, destroying houses, ranches, and churches, and succeeding mightily. Within 2 months, all Spaniards living in New Mexico were either dead or had been driven out of the territory. Writers have emphasized the religious aspects of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. They have focused on the charismatic Popeye and his ability to coordinate so many pueblos. These authors have also been rightly impressed by the burning and defacing of churches and the torturing and killing of friars during the uprising. So this is all true, and surely religion was a factor in this uprising. However, in my book, I also tried to make the case that while religion certainly played a role, the Spanish enslavement of New Mexican indigenous peoples played also a major role in triggering this massive rebellion. For one thing, the rebellion leaders explicitly talked about this. One of the demands of the Pueblo rebels was, and I quote, that all classes of Indians forcibly held by the Spaniards be given back to the rebels. Moreover, one of the rebellion leaders asked, and I quote, that his wife and children be given up to him, and likewise that all the Apache men and women whom the Spaniards had captured in war be turned over to them. The geography of the uprising is just as suggestive about the importance of the Indian slave trade. Although the uprising is popularly known as the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, as I have called it, the movement actually encompassed a large swath of territory along the slaving corridors leading south from New Mexico to the mining region of Chihuahua, and also west to what is now Sonora in northwestern Mexico. So this is the map that you're seeing there. The arrows show what I call the slaving corridors, and the shaded area is the area that rose in the 1680s. And so you can see that there is a very close correlation between the slaving corridors and the areas that rose up in this massive insurrection. One of the most fascinating aspects of the phenomenon of Indian slavery is the involvement of indigenous peoples themselves. Native Americans participated in the slaving enterprise since the very beginning of European colonization. However, at first, they played a secondary role to the Europeans, who, after all, possessed the most developed warfare technologies, and I'm thinking especially of firearms and horses. Indigenous peoples became local suppliers, junior partners, guides, guardsmen, and intermediaries. But with the passage of time, Native Americans came to acquire European weaponry and horses, and as they increased their power, they also came to control a larger share of the traffic in natives. And so by the 18th and 19th centuries, they had taken control of much of this business. No other nation attained the spectacular success of the Comanches, which became the preeminent suppliers of indigenous slaves to other natives as well as to European colonists in the Southwest, to the Spanish, to the English, and to the French in the regions. And so this is the slide, the map that you're seeing on your screen is a slide of Comancheria. So that is the homeland of the Comanche people. So wedged, this is a territory, an expansive territory wedged between New Mexico and Texas, which became a major trading center, as recent work by many scholars, including Pekka Hammerlein and Brian DeLay, Joaquin Rivalla Martinez, and others, have made clear. According to one witness, in 1744, Comanche trading parties traveled, and I quote, more than 1,000 leagues, so 4,000 miles from New Mexico in the course of a year, acquiring captives and returning to offer their loot in the trading fairs of New Mexico. One missionary recorded the enthusiasm caused by the arrival of such trading embassies. Here's what he said. Here's the governor and his lieutenants gathered together as many horses, metal tools, and everything possible as they can for trade and barter with these barbarians in exchange for deer and buffalo hides. And what is saddest, in exchange for Indian slaves, men and women, small and large, a great multitude of people. Comanches themselves, for Comanches themselves, the Indian slave trade was not just a business, but a way of life. Comanches sold some of their slaves, but they also retained a large portion of their captives. One witness noticed that, and I quote, nearly every family among the Comanches had one or two captives. Many of the captives were women who were incorporated in Comanche societies as secondary wives and were put to work immediately. So Comanche men hunted bison, but the women were the ones who processed the dead animals, preparing the meat and curing the hides, an extraordinarily labor-intensive activity. Successful Comanche men could have 5, 10, or more wives. In addition to women, boys were constituted another significant contingent of slaves in Comancheria. The main occupation of these boys was tending to the animals. As Comanches grew stronger, they accumulated horses and mules, and managing all of these herds required prodigious amount of labor that neither the warriors nor the women were able to provide. And so it was not uncommon, but for such boy slaves to be in charge of 70, 80, 100, 150 horses, a grueling work that required constant vigilance and enormous stamina, especially if you can imagine in the winter conditions in this area. In sum, for Comanches and other groups in the American Southwest, slaves constituted a very versatile commodity that could be used as an exploited underclass, as pawns that could be exchanged for kin members captured by other groups, or simply as the most ubiquitous form of currency in the region, as we saw in the New Mexico fairs. Indian slavery engulfed the entire American continent, as I try to argue in my book, but the timing varied depending on the region. By the 19th century, Indian slavery had nearly disappeared in the eastern seaboard of the United States. In colonial times, the Carolinas had been a major slaving ground. New Englanders had impressed rebellious Indians and shipped them to the Caribbean, and the French colonies in eastern Canada had procured thousands of native captives from the interior, from the Great Lakes region. However, during the 18th and early 19th centuries, the traffic of natives was largely replaced and overshadowed by African slavery. Yet Indian slavery continued to thrive in the West, and the best evidence for this comes from letters and diaries of westbound Americans. So in New Mexico, for example, James S. Calhoun, the first Indian agent of the territory, could not hide his amazement at the sophistication of the Indian slave market in New Mexico. And this is what he had to say. The value of the captives depends upon age, sex, beauty, and usefulness. Good-looking females not having passed the sear and yellow leaf are valued from $50 to $150 each. Males, as they may be useful, one half less, never more. Similarly, California may have entered the Union as a quote-unquote free soil state, but American settlers soon discovered that the buying and selling of natives was a common practice. As early as 1846, the first American commander of San Francisco acknowledged that, and I quote him, "Certain persons have been and still are imprisoning and holding to service Indians against their will, and warned the general public that the Indian population must not be regarded in the light of slaves." End of quote. His pleas, however, went unheeded. The first California legislature passed the so-called Indian Act of 1850, which authorized the arrest of quote-unquote vagrant natives who could then be quote-unquote hired out to the highest bidder. This act also enabled white persons to go before a justice of the peace to obtain Indian children for quote-unquote indenture. According to one scholarly estimate, the Indian Act of 1850 may have affected as many as 20,000 California indigenous peoples, including 4,000 children kidnapped from their parents and used primarily as domestic servants and farm laborers in California. Mormon settlers, finally we get to the map that you have in front of you. Mormon settlers arrived in Utah in the 1840s, looking for a new beginning, a new land, only to discover that indigenous peoples and Mexicans had already turned this area in the Great Basin into a slaving ground. The area was and remains a gigantic moonscape of bleached sands, salt flats, and mountain ranges inhabited by small bands, no larger than extended families. Early travelers did not hide their contempt for these quote-unquote digger Indians lacking horses and weapons. These indigenous peoples, however, were vulnerable and easy prey for mounted Indians. So Brigham Young and his followers, by establishing themselves in this area, became the most obvious outlet for such captives. So hesitant at first, Mormons required some encouragement. Slavers tortured children with knives or hot irons to call attention to their trade, or threatened to kill any child that went unpurchased. Brigham Young's son-in-law, Charles Decker, witnessed the execution of an indigenous girl before he agreed to exchange his gun for another captive. In the end, Mormons became buyers and even found a way to rationalize their participation in this human market. And I quote Brigham Young, who said, "Buy up the Lamanite children." The Lamanite was the term they used for indigenous. "Buy up the Lamanite children," he counseled his brethren. and educate them and teach them the gospel so that many generations would not pass before they should become a white and delightsome people. End of quote. It was the very same logic that Spanish conquistadors had used since the 16th century to justify the acquisition of indigenous slaves. So persistent and widespread was Indian slavery that ending it proved nearly impossible. The Spanish crown had prohibited native bondage under all circumstances since 1542. This was the moment when the Spanish crown passed the so-called new laws that categorically prohibited Indian slavery. Yet the traffic continued. To retain mastery over the natives that they already possessed, European owners resorted to a variety of euphemisms and subterfuges that amounted to slavery in all but name. So, for example, they, instead of calling them slaves, they started calling them Indians in deposit, quote unquote, in deposits, or Indians who were impressed and were serving out their sentences could be hired out, quote unquote, hired out. So the technicality was that they were not selling their persons, but they were merely selling their labor. So the traffic continued. Another attempt at abolition occurred in the early 19th century, especially on the south of the border, when the newly independent Republic of Mexico prohibited all forms of native bondage and extended citizenship rights to all indigenous peoples who had been born within Mexico. Yet this was not enough, and Indian slavery persisted in Mexico. One more opportunity, of course, arose immediately after the Civil War in this country. The United States Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which, as you can see on the screen, prohibited both slavery and involuntary servitude. This formulation opened the possibility of liberation of all Native Americans held in bondage in the West. However, in various rulings in the 1870s and 1880s, the Supreme Court opted for a narrow interpretation of the 13th and 14th Amendments that applied primarily to African Americans and generally excluded Native Americans. Congress also passed an act abolishing the system known as peonage, defined, and I quote, as the voluntary or involuntary service or labor of any persons as peons in liquidation of any debt or obligation that exists in the Western states. This was peonage, or debt peonage, was the system used primarily in the 19th century to that was used as subterfuge for slavery, both in Mexico and in the United States. And even though there was this congressional law, this Peonage Act of 1867, forbidding it or prescribing it, the written word alone was not enough to eliminate a practice that had gone on for centuries. Forms of native bondage continued in the United States through the end of the 19th century and in some remote areas even into the 20th century. So today, 45.8 million people in 167 countries live in some form of modern slavery, according to some estimates of the Walk Free Foundation. Slavery is prohibited all over the world, yet not a single region of our globe has been spared from this practice. Slavery continues to thrive because its beneficiaries resort to debts or prison sentences or some other subterfuge to compel people to work under the threat of violence and offering absurdly low or no compensation. With this growing awareness about present-day slavery, what lessons can we derive from the 400-year experience of Native Americans with the so-called other slavery? I think that the emphasis on the newness of the contemporary forms of bondage is misplaced. Clearly, this is something that has been going on for a long time, for centuries in the case of Native Americans. And as I have, so it is only by contemplating this longer trajectory that we can gain a measure of the breathtaking dynamism and staying power of the other slavery, as I've called it, and its related forms of involuntary servitude, and the tremendous difficulties of ending it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andres. Before we stop the recording and continue with the Q&A, please don't leave. On behalf of the Office of Research Administration, Social Justice Group, thank you again, Dr. Resendez, for presenting your fascinating findings, and we wish you more success in spreading this information.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to hear about